You've probably heard people talking about the Overton Window. Maybe the cool children in the playground are inventing rap songs about it. Perhaps you're in a sewing circle and Betsy made something like this. Or maybe someone on Twitter just casually name-checked it to make themselves sound smarter. This has shifted the Overton Window, they'll say solemnly. Or, please stop peering through my Overton window, sir. Or, your Overton window is closing fast. Soon you'll be completely depleted of eggs. But what is the Overton window exactly? Where did it come from? Who made it? And why was it designed to undermine left-wing politics and hand cultural dominance to right-wing neoliberal extremists? Huh? Why is that? Answer me, damn it! First things first, don't for one moment confuse the term The Overton Window with the novel of the same name by former Fox News host Glenn Beck. Beck's book is a conspiracy thriller which opens with a man getting sniped in the head while in a phone box in the middle of the desert, at night. Beck has referred to the book as faction, which according to him is a new genre, fiction based on fact. Faction. What a shame that's already a word, Glenn. And a genre. I had planned to do a bit here about how I read the whole book as research for this video, and then do a bit of clowning around at Beck's expense making fun of him and his novel, but he didn't even write it, and his ghostwriter just reused the plot from another novel they'd written before, so it's not even worth trying to leverage some mirth out of it at Beck's expense. And that's really disappointing. What we can say with confidence is that Beck was instrumental in bringing the concept of the Overton Window into the public consciousness, even if his novel doesn't quite understand what that theory actually means. Whatever. So, the Overton Window, the actual Overton Window, is a concept first put forward by Joseph P. Overton. Only that's not quite true, but we'll get back to that in a bit. Joe Overton was a senior vice president of the Mackinac Center for Public Policy, a right-wing, free-market, neoliberal think tank. So you know that whatever theories they put out will definitely be in the best interests of everyday people like you and me. The basic concept of the Overton Window is there is a way of measuring the range of public opinion on any given issue from this idea is insane, just absolutely unthinkable, right through to this is extremely sensible. So sensible, in fact, that we actually do it. It's the law. For instance, in somewhere like America, the idea of free healthcare has been considered basically an extreme position for decades, something that would get you laughed out of the room if you were to propose it. But over the last few years, there's been a real shift in public discourse, and now not only is it a perfectly acceptable position for the average voter to hold, the media are also beginning to take it seriously, and it's looking increasingly like it might actually become government policy at some point. Maybe. So that's the basic crux of the conceit, that there's a window of acceptable political discussion. Anything within the window is seen as normal discourse, but as you get further outside that window, the positions are seen as more fringe and radical. Once a public position comes to be seen as sensible, when it sits in that window, what usually happens is politicians latch onto it, because they're craven, hollow husks, and they change the laws of the land to accommodate for that shift in public opinion. But the Overton Window isn't just a descriptive tool, it's a strategic one. And that's no secret. The Mackinac Center, who try to maintain some sense of propriety over the concept, say as much on their website. The whole point of it is that by being able to stratify political issues in terms of acceptability, you'll be better able to manipulate that window of acceptability by shunting public opinion in the direction you want it to go. It's a tool that can be used to help get policy recommendations enacted into law. This can happen from the bottom up, as in grassroots campaigns, or it can be triggered from the top down by, say, an influential right-wing free-market neoliberal think tank publishing papers, or sending their people to appear on TV or radio or make posts on social media to push their talking points. One of the curious things about the Overton Window is that Mr. Overton never actually published any single paper about it, at least nothing available in the public domain. He didn't name it the Overton Window, or give any talks on it. There's actually very little information about its origins. There are a couple of Overton's essays online that talk about paradigm shifts and the influence of policy, but nothing you could conclusively point to and say, yeah, this is it. This is the first mention of the window theory by Joseph Overton. If you go on the Mackinac Center's website, what you get instead is a description of a meeting between Overton and the now president of the Mackinac Center, Joseph Lemon. Here's what he says.
The migration from mere ideas to law of the land can be described by a model called the Overton Window. This is the term my colleagues and I gave to a theory developed by Joseph Overton. After Joe died, I built a presentation around his idea, and I still use it to show how think tanks can shift public policy. Joe shared his abstract concept with me in the mid-1990s. He observed that any collection of public policies can be arranged in order from more free to less free into what he called a window of political possibility.
So, Overton came up with the idea, and after he died peacefully in a plane crash in 2003, his colleagues took the idea, fleshed it out, and started promoting it as the Overton Window, presumably because it sounds infinitely cooler than the window of political possibility. In doing so, they created a tool that could be used to mainstream and propagandize right-wing talking points and demonize and marginalize left-wing political talking points. If that makes your eyebrow rise so high up that it slides down your back and tickles your bum, let's hear Lemon describe the concept of the Overton Window on Glenn Beck's old Fox News show.
To go through life. You can be the kind of person who loves to eat sausage and you just don't want to know where it came from, or you're the type of person who has to know how the sausage is made. In doing my research on what's happening in America and also for my new thriller, The Overton Window, I came across the ingredients that they put in the political process called the Overton Window theory. With me now is Joseph Lehman, president of the Mackinac Center for Public Policy, which is the Michigan think tank that named the technique the Overton Window.
At any given point in time, a politician can't choose any policy he wants. He can only choose those things that the voters will find acceptable, or else he risks getting unelected.
Right. Okay.
And so here's a spectrum that shows possible policies in education. At one extreme, you might have private schools are outlawed and only government indoctrination in government schools.
Okay.
Over here, you might have no government schools whatsoever. It's moved a huge deal.
Okay.
For example, at one extreme, you could have there isn't any such thing as private charity.
Which the Obama administration tried to do when he first got into office.
Look at the way it's framed by Lemon. More authority, less authority. Less freedom, more freedom. In other words, very bad and very good. All mapped onto a diagram that runs from left to right. And just in case that was too subtle a point for your brain, look at how that diagram's coloured. It's the respective colours of the Democrat and Republican parties. The left is subtly being associated with authority, the right with freedom. Lovely, delicious freedom. You want freedom, don't you? Well, there it is, on the right. This bias is built into the model as a sort of inherent vice, and the fact that people now exclusively talk about the Overton Window in terms of left and right politics seems to buoy that idea out pretty well. In the mind of Joe Overton and the people at the Mackinac Center who fleshed out the theory, more government authority is undesirable. Ask anybody on the street whether they think they should have more freedom or less freedom. No one's going to say they want to be controlled more, therefore less authority is de facto the more desirable option. It's pretty hard to rationalize the window as a neutral scientific observation because that just doesn't seem to reflect reality. There's a simple explanation for this. It wasn't devised as a neutral scientific observation. It was developed as a blueprint for changing the direction of acceptable discourse in American politics to the benefit of free market enterprise. When the Mackinac Center roll this idea out, they're framing their policies as promoting freedom. They also just happen to be right-wing. What's being implied is that all of their free enterprise ideas posit less authority, so any ideas against this must be leftist and authoritative, because it's a reductive system, a way of attempting to control not just discussion, but discussions about discussions. And this comes back to the Chomsky quote at the start of this video where he talks about controlling the bounds of what is acceptable discussion and what isn't. Now, I'm not here to debate whether the Democrat Party is left-wing or not. That's almost totally besides the point, which is to limit the scope of your understanding of the world into extremely binary positions. Authority and freedom, left and right, bad and good.
The truth and the truth.
In the interests of fairness, let's just go back to that segment on the Glenn Beck show. It is entirely possible that this colour coding was chosen by the good folk of Fox News and that lemon had nothing to do with that choice. The Mackinac Centre goes to pains on its website to point out that the Overton window is politically neutral. But this is like doing a 500-piece jigsaw puzzle, leaving out one piece and then saying it's impossible to tell what the picture is. Everyone can see what the picture is, even if it's not complete. It's a duck. The Overton window lays it all out for us to see issues as politically diametric, and then when people jump to the obvious conclusion that actually this is about measuring things in terms of a left-right dichotomy, they can go, "Whoa, you said it, buddy, not us." Look at how leftism is portrayed today. The authoritarian left. The screaming social justice warriors who want to loose hordes of rapists into women's bathrooms. The violent Antifa mob who wants to crush all dissent or deviation from the acceptable line of thought. The political correctness brigade who want to control everything you say. The very moderate form of democratic socialism that's somehow painted as Stalinism 2.0. It's crazy how well this has worked. I genuinely believe the popularization of the Overton window has helped to accelerate this polarization we see in contemporary politics, and in particular the demonization of left-wing politics as inherently authoritarian, and I think that's at least in part by design. Over the last 15 years, the Overton window has been picked up, popularized, and relentlessly policed by the media, who represent the interests of the establishment. Again, that's no secret. The majority of the media in America and in my own country, the UK, is owned by a handful of very rich people and operated by people who, more often than not, come from similar socio-economic and racial backgrounds and who have directly benefited from things being the way they are. This is the establishment, and it's in the interest of this establishment to float ideas that maintain the present power structures and economic models. Float an idea outside the accepted scope of the window, and you'll be called crazy by the media, mocked by these new gatekeepers of the Overton window. The idea that there's an acceptable range of political discourse isn't really news. I mean, eventually someone was going to come along and put a name on it, but by being the first one to do so, the people at this right-wing, free-market, neoliberal think tank were able to spoil the seed, and now we're all eating its poison fruit. The Overton window has tainted how people perceive left and right politics. It's not even really a window, is it? It feels more like a peephole on a slider. It can go one way or the other. There's no sense of nuance. It's perfectly understandable that they'd want to tip the scales in their favour. I mean, why would a think tank release anything out into the public unless it was to further their own agenda? But for them to say it's a politically neutral construct is just insulting in so many ways. It's probably worth noting at this point some of the problems I have with the Overton window as a theory. On the face of it, it sounds like common sense, a useful way of looking at political issues, but as we've seen, there appears to be a built-in bias for one particular strand of contemporary American politics, that of free market enterprise. Everything is stacked in terms of it being for or in opposition to what American right-wing libertarians want, and that's not a particularly useful way of looking at the world. We've also seen how the theory limits the scope and scale of discussions by placing all political issues along a single measurement of some arbitrary definition of authority. Then there's the matter of saying that there's a window of acceptable discussion. This is just vague. Public opinion isn't a single measurement, it's an aggregation of millions of individual perspectives. You can't just say this is what's acceptable to talk about and this isn't. Politics is divisive. The public isn't a single body. Take an issue like abortion in America. What's its Overton window? It feels like it completely depends on which state you're in. If you take America as a whole, it's perfectly reasonable to say that both pro- and anti-abortion stances are acceptable for public discussion. Is this some sort of Schrodinger's window? There are no real answers to these and other questions because it's all just fluff, a pop theory. It might be taken by the media as some sort of inviolable law of political science, but there's not much by way of actual science behind it. Theories, remember, have to be backed up with evidence, and the Overton window has a scant, if non-existent amount of evidence to support it. All Overton has put forward is an assertion, but that's not enough for a theory. It's not grounded in evidence. If it was, there'd be data, books, and academic studies to support it and make a legitimate case. But there's barely any academic interest in the Overton window theory. And although that doesn't prove anything one way or the other, it should set off some alarm bells if the academic community is just outright ignoring something so prominent in culture. The only real book we have on it is this one. Did Overton or Lemon or anyone at the Mackinac Centre develop a definitive way of measuring mainstream public opinion? Did they set up a series of testable predictions about how public opinion shifts over time and how this can be measured against exposure to extreme positions being advocated? Did they do any actual work at all to establish their claim empirically? Or did they just come up with this thing one day and think, that sounds about right, and then everyone just kind of went along with it? In fact, there's every reason to believe the opposite of the theory is true, that public opinion is determined by a consensus of an establishment made up of the private sector, government, the media, politicians and so forth. They set the tune which, by and large, the public dances to. In this sense, politicians don't detect the Overton window so much as dictate it. If this establishment doesn't want to advocate your cause, it's going to be much harder for you to table it in the first place to try to change public opinion. Again, the scales are tipped in favour of those who would cite the Overton window back at us. And there have been actual academics who've done actual research and written actual books which outline actual theories who say this, like Noam Chomsky, who co-wrote a book called Manufacturing Consent, and John Zahler in The Nature and Origins of Mass Opinions. I'd like to know exactly what data the people at the Mackinac Centre used to develop the Overton window theory, although I'm pretty sure I could guess the answer. Have you seen the latest version of Monopoly? Controversial, right? All over the world, people are getting really worked up about these new versions of Monopoly. But this is all just a marketing ploy that people are playing into. It's a distraction. And while people are preoccupied telling us which version of Monopoly makes them angrier, or buying copies of the version that they think will make their grandparents angry, or even engaging in any way with these prefabricated discussion points, it means they're not talking about the real issue at hand, which is that Monopoly sucks. But nobody, for instance, is talking about dismantling Hasbro, or demolishing its entire business model and handing control of the company to its workers instead of its shareholders. You say something like that as a talking head on breakfast television, and you'll be looked at as if you've grown a second head. Monopoly has been one of the best-selling board games in the world since its release in 1935, having shipped a massive 275 million copies. Monopoly's owners, Hasbro, has revenues of over $5 billion. It's the largest toy manufacturer on the stock market. They've come under heavy fire for labor abuses in its factories in China. Their whole profit margins are based on exploitation on a massive scale, and yet they've managed to get people talking about what? Millennial monopoly? Or monopoly where women get more money than men? I mean, who genuinely gives a shit about this sort of thing? But of course, if you do give a shit, and you genuinely get offended by the idea of playing a version of Monopoly where women get more money than men, well, you can just lodge your protest by buying the classic version of Monopoly, because you're a straight-down-the-line kind of guy, and that's the Monopoly that resonates most with you, as a strong individual member of society, where there's a version of Monopoly tailor-made for every personality type and worldview. With every new Monopoly release, Hasbro increases their buzz and generates more wealth for their shareholders. The news media gets something to fill their pages or airtime with, which generates views or clicks for them and nets them ad revenue. It's an ecosystem, and you're the plankton. Well, the factory workers are the plankton. You're like, I don't know, a slug or something. One of the most famous quotes from Thomas Pynchon's novel Gravity's Rainbow is, "If they can get you asking the wrong questions, they don't have to worry about the answers." And this is exactly the kind of sleight of hand that Hasbro are undertaking. It's the same sleight of hand that the Overton window is trying to pull on you, which is where this seemingly wacky tangent brings it back around. Hasbro literally don't care about what costume they put on their corpse of a board game as long as they can make money from it without isolating too large a share of their audience. It generates controversy, but it's a safe, manufactured controversy. It generates discussion without getting you to think too hard about things that are important. You won't, for instance, be seeing a Black Lives Matter monopoly anytime soon, or a dismantle hierarchies monopoly. Not because they won't sell. I mean, I'd buy them probably. No, you won't see them because that kind of thing would be too controversial. Not the safe controversy that's been focus group tested and vetted by 7 layers of corporate marketing committees. No, the kind of controversy that would be counter to their goals of maintaining a social status quo and maximizing profits for their shareholders. In this sense, Hasbro are doing their part to control the scope of acceptable discussion, and by doing so are trying to distract you from the fact that, as far as board games go, Monopoly is really, really bad. Right-wing think tanks are incredibly well-funded. This is no surprise, they work in the interests of the wealthy. Billionaires and corporations pour huge amounts of money, well, small amounts to them, but huge to you and me, into these organizations who then undertake projects that seek to shift the system to the advantage of their masters. I mean, donors. Oh, no I don't. It's not just think tanks that operate in this way. There's something like 15 mega wealthy men who own almost all the news media in America. That's a sick concentration of power and influence. And with this influence, they set the baseline narrative from which all discussion must start. These people, these companies, don't just own the newspapers and national and local TV news. They own radio stations, magazines, film studios. In 1983, 90% of all media in the US was controlled by 50 companies. By 2012, 90% was owned by just 6 companies. It's not just America, this is replicated all around the world. In the UK, just 3 companies dominate more than 80% of the national newspaper market. And over the last 20 years, these same entities have been appropriating the way we access and even perceive the internet. This isn't a conspiracy, it's a factual description of the world. If you're old enough to remember the internet before Google, you'll know what I'm talking about. The internet is to a large extent becoming homogenized and brought into line with what a handful of companies want it to be. If you don't play by the rules, well, you might be punished by the algorithm and not get any visitors. There's no evil cabal running things from a dark boardroom in an underwater lair, but there is an establishment working to perpetuate its own interests, and the biases of this establishment run deep. The Overton Window is just one small example of where these vested interests are trying to maintain cultural and political dominance. Think about it. By rigging the Overton Window to try to equate left-wing politics with authority, it means the model can't cope with an idea that's both left-wing and anti-authority. Try to plug something like council communism or any form of libertarian anarchism into the Overton Window model and it would just melt. The scope has been narrowed to such a degree that it can't allow you to conceive of anything outside the limitations imposed on its design. It's like the human eye. It can only perceive the tiniest sliver of the electromagnetic spectrum, and yet there's so much more going on that we can't see simply because of the physical limitations of the eye. If you can't see X-rays or infrared light, you probably don't think about them a lot. You can only understand the universe in terms of what you perceive. And the same is true of politics. So, to get around this, we're going to have to hack the Overton Window, shake up its model just a little bit to broaden the spectrum, change the common perception of it so that it can begin to accept ideas that couldn't normally be factored into it. This could be a useful tool if it was more balanced. We need to turn that simplistic, thought-limiting binary model into something that has a bit more cultural dimension to it. Let's say the political compass model. There. Now, instead of a one-dimensional slider, we can give ideas a bit more nuance. Do away with the Overton peephole and fan it out into an actual window. Now add some curtains to represent fringe ideas, and a dead turd on fire in the centre to represent the dead turd on fire that is the centre. Of course, there's no reason the axes have to stop there. You could develop a model for an Overton tesseract that would help to map ideas acceptable to the public mainstream across a whole array of different dimensions like demographics or geographic location. I'm sure I'm way behind the curve here. There are already think tanks and data processing companies who are devoting huge resources to developing algorithms that can articulate these kinds of models and how best to exploit them to their own ends. We can already see some of the fruits of this labour. Targeted political advertising uses the trail of information breadcrumbs we all leave behind on the internet. These things are helping to establish a dominance of culture, an oligarchy of eternity. This isn't to say that the political compass model itself is perfect. It's almost impossible to pin any single person's complete ideological beliefs on a set of two coordinates, but as Bob Dylan says, the human mind can only stand so much. So, without the power of quantum computing and all the personal data at Mark Zuckerberg's command, I think it's best to keep things fairly straightforward. In popular culture, the Overton window has become a byword for accepted discourse, but its framing isn't neutral, and I don't think it's supposed to be. There's a low-key corruption that was imbued into the model at the point of its conception. In some respects, this is a battle that's already been borne out. When people talk about the Overton window, they speak of things in terms of left and right political ideas rather than more authority and less authority, which is exactly what the Mackinac Centre said it wasn't supposed to be, although it clearly was. But I think we can start over by rethinking how we perceive the Overton window. We can turn it into a tool that helps people to think about issues in less black and white terms without overwhelming them or making things too complex. If we map Overton's window onto this basic political compass structure, which measures issues across both economic and social dimensions, it becomes more helpful in terms of how we can see what ideas are acceptable. And we can use that to better strategize. This simple twist removes the unspoken rule at the heart of the window theory, that ideas of the political right are somehow inherently more free, and politically left ideas are authoritarian and also bad and very scary. Ooh, spooky leftism. But how do we do this? Well, first change should come from within. You should change the way that you think about the Overton window now. The idea's in your brain now too, so whenever you see a reference to the Overton window, think of it in terms of these two dimensions. Let it act as a little alarm bell to step outside of whatever's being talked about to question who's saying it, why they're saying it, who they work for, and what they might be trying to get out of the discussion. You should obviously try to do this for everything you read or hear or see, but if you can start by Pavloving yourself into doing it at any mention of the Overton window, then you can get into better habits of critical thinking. The exact sort of critical thinking that this current iteration of the Overton window is trying to anesthetize out of you. Give in to the Overton window. This is the only way that you can think about political issues. Trying to form alternative narratives is difficult because the people who are trying to do it are critically underfunded and under-resourced. But by working together, by being smart and pooling our resources, people can make a difference. Crowdfunding, grassroots organisation, lobbying unions for funding, even getting some like-minded celebrities on board to advocate are all really relatively simple but effective ways of building a resistance to the manufacturing of consent, which is essential to changing people's minds on issues that affect their lives. We could set up our own think tanks to try to counter the onslaught of thought-limiting messages that well-funded establishment institutes are pumping out every single day. Even you just sending a tweet or talking to your friends about issues is really important. Or sharing this video. Perennial silly Billy Alex Jones says there's a war on for your mind. An info war. And you know what? He's right. But not in the way he thinks, obviously. I mean, he's off talking about giant interdimensional praying mantises torturing your soul, but as a metaphor for the establishment manufacturing your consent, that's pretty much on the money. But don't actually give Alex Jones your money, though. Or time, or attention. Just put on your tinfoil helmet, cadet, and enlist for your info duty. For instance, in my last video, I talked about how we might need to collectively reassess certain aspects of the restrictions we currently place on freedom of speech, so that we can better defend the minorities who would be most damaged by those who abused current freedoms. And if you agree with that position, maybe you should talk about it more. If you talk about an issue, that shifts the Overton window almost imperceptibly in one direction. But if enough people raise the profile of an issue, that becomes a genuine talking point that can't be ignored. And if you can get people to argue against something that wouldn't usually even be countenanced, well, you've scored a minor victory. There's not suddenly going to be a huge pot of money overnight that would allow us to set up a perfect oppositional system to counter the mainstream propaganda narratives. It's going to take time, as well as individual and coordinated effort to make a real difference. We're all held in place on Earth by gravity, but don't forget that you have gravity as an individual, and your gravity does have an effect on the Earth. We may not be able to move the planets, but if we can come together, we'd have an undeniable, unstoppable force all of our own. Look at the trans rights movement, which in the last few years has seen trans people going from being an extremely marginalised group to a hot-button issue being discussed on breakfast television. I think if you told anyone 10 years ago that trans rights would become a major social talking point, you'd have been greeted with, at best, skepticism. But this didn't happen overnight. It took the efforts of hundreds, thousands of people pushing for years to get their voices heard, and it's paying off. Like all the great civil rights movements, as well as sexual dynamics, this should be powered from the bottom up. Trans and non-binary people are still very much marginalised, and there's a long way to go, but there's no denying that these issues are on the map in a way they weren't even a decade ago. That's astonishing, and it shows us that things can and do change. Sometimes. We need to think about how we can make the most of the resources we have to fight back against the bullshit and get into grips with things like the Overton Window and understanding how it can be modified to be a tool for helping regular people rather than helping the billionaire-funded free enterprise think tanks is one way of doing that, even though those tools have been developed to specifically lock us out. We shouldn't just be thinking about this conceit on the terms it was established because it's inherently partisan, constructed to confine the debate and continually shift it in one direction. The poet and philosopher John Milton wrote, "They who have put out the people's eyes reproach them of their blindness." This is maybe more true today than it was when it was written. It's the political equivalent of stop hitting yourself. You're despised for being ignorant by the very people who seek to make you ignorant. Political discourse today is like Monopoly, the Overton Window edition. It's all smoke and mirrors, clever tricks and conceits, a distraction from the actual problems of the world in which we live. It's designed to perpetuate existing structures, always wanting you to play the game without questioning whether the whole thing's rigged in the first place. So stop engaging with the Overton Window on the terms it was designed, because that's the game they want you to play. The game they don't want you to play is for much higher stakes. Thanks for watching. My heartfelt thanks go out to Jangle Science Lad for lending his beautiful voice to this video. He has his own YouTube channel which is incredibly good, and you should go and check it out immediately. I mean that. There's a link in the description below. He's doing some really interesting things, and he does a phenomenal amount of research for his videos and debates to make sure that his arguments are weighted by actual science and data, as opposed to my videos which are just the product of my unfiltered unconscious. I'd also like to give a huge thanks to Twitter user Ozymandias123 for creating this beautiful animation for this video. A massive thanks also to all of my patrons over at Patreon. I actually have patrons now. Are you ready? Roll the credits. Astonishing. If you'd like to join this elite club, there's a link in the description below. But there are other ways to help this channel that involve almost zero effort on your part, like clicking the like button, or sharing the video, or subscribing to this channel. Maybe you're the ghost of Joseph Overton, and you have some important information about the origins of your window theory. If you are, leave a comment. Bye!
Loves to eat sausage